you had a son, and your child fell into a well on the Sabbath, wouldn't you help him out? How are you? How are you doing? It's a question that I'm asking you right now, and how are you doing? Questions. Jesus asked a lot of questions, and certainly when I ask you that question, I do care about how you are doing. I hope you know that. But what I know in Jesus is that He cares about us, and He asked a lot of questions in the Gospels because He cared about the people that He was encountering. He cares about His creation. What I know is true is that those questions that He asked then, He's still asking now. In Luke chapter 14, I was reading it this past week, actually today, and Jesus asks a couple questions right in the beginning. He's having a conversation with some individuals about Sabbath, and He asks a question, is it lawful to heal on the Sabbath? Then He goes further to ask, if you had a son, and your child fell into a well on the Sabbath, wouldn't you help him out? Would you help your son out if they needed help on the Sabbath? Right? Certainly there's context, there's some religious context, but as I hear those questions being asked and I think about those questions, I let them settle into my own heart, in my own mind, I am reminded that God gave us Sabbath. He commanded Sabbath, in fact, in His big 10 commandments for us, for you, and for me, so that we would receive healing. Right? Sabbath, Jesus says, it's not for God, it's for man. Right? To rest in God, to be healed by God. So I don't know where your heart and your mind is going as we let Jesus ask this question, is it lawful to heal on the Sabbath? But what I know is true is that you and I, we need a lot of healing. I hope you can be honest with that. And it's not necessarily physical healing. Yes, there's physical healing that we need, right? But there's soulful healing, there's emotional healing, there's relational healing. And I love it that God gave us the Sabbath so that we could come to Him for healing. Sabbath rest, Sabbath healing. And so I don't know what that looks like for you. The Scriptures has part of the Sabbath being a sacred assembly. Right? And this has not changed in Christendom as being a disciple of Jesus. Many of you have heard me say this before, and I'll say it again. Right? Jesus had one habit that the Scriptures tell us that He had, a habit, right? Something that He did weekly. Jesus prayed all the time, right? And certainly He had other things that He just did all the time. But a habit, the Scriptures say, He went to the synagogue every Sabbath. Right? To set the example for us, the Scriptures call it the sacred assembly. That would be part of our Sabbath. Right? The sacred assembly, why did Jesus set that example? It's a place where you and I can find healing. It's a place where Jesus says, where 2 or 3 are gathered in my name. And if you're remembering the Sabbath, if you're living in my truth, if you're singing them out, singing is praying twice when it comes to our faith and singing faithful songs. Right? When you're coming into the Word, when you're coming into communion moments, right? When you're praying, right? That's where Jesus shows up. And He says He shows up in the sacred assembly. Disciples have known this, and so I don't know where you are when it comes to Sabbath, when it comes to sacred assembly, but as Jesus asks this question, is it lawful to heal on the Sabbath? Yes, it is, because that's what Jesus does on the Sabbath. That's what He does in the sacred assembly, in the worship moment when you are directly, intentionally geared towards giving God worship and receiving what He wants to give to you in this relationship. And yes, we're worshiping God all the time, right? We're resting in God all the time, but yet there's a moment that God commanded for us to have in our weekly lives, in our daily lives, to set aside to be with Him. And in that moment, He promises to give healing. Healing. So He knows all that's going on in our heart and our mind. Maybe it is a physical healing. Maybe God's going to show up in an amazing way in that moment. But even more than that, we know that spiritual healing takes place. Spiritual healing takes place in the context of the sacred assembly in Sabbath. Right? There is forgiveness, there are His promises, there is His truth, there is His Spirit being poured out more into our lives. And so I hope for you and for me that we can receive healing on the Sabbath, that we will make the Sabbath a priority in our lives, just like thou shalt not murder, right? Thou shalt not steal, thou shalt remember the Sabbath day and keep it holy, because God wants to give us healing, and so many of us need healing emotionally, relationally, right? Yes, physically, right? We need healing, and God promises to bring that to us in Sabbath. And so something to think about today, and I encourage you to read the Gospels, and when you read the Gospels, when you hear Jesus ask a question, stop and let that question come into your heart, into your mind, and work through that with Jesus. And so may Jesus give you healing. May you remember that He is true Sabbath, and certainly heaven someday, the true place of rest. And until then, may we remember the Sabbath day. May we keep it holy. May Jesus continue to bring healing into all of our lives. Have a great week. We hope to see you this weekend in worship as we continue our sermon series based on the questions that Jesus asked His disciples and that He's still asking us today.